Imagine you're on a plane. You don't know where you're going, but it's definitely not home. This was the reality for 14 West African men in early September 2025. They were put on a U.S. military cargo plane, taken from a detention center in Louisiana, and flown thousands of miles across the Atlantic. When they finally landed, they weren't in their home countries, they were in Ghana. The strange thing is, none of them were actually Ghanaian citizens. The group was made up of 13 men from Nigeria and 1 man from the Gambia. This was the first flight under a new, very controversial agreement between the United States and Ghana. This whole situation started with a deal that not many people knew about. The Ghanaian government, led by President John Dramani Mahama, quietly agreed to a plan with the Trump administration in the United States. The deal says that Ghana will accept deportees from the US, even if they are not from Ghana. The idea is to take in people from other West African countries who the US wants to remove, but can't send back to their original homes for various reasons. So, Ghana essentially became a temporary, or maybe not so temporary, drop-off point. This has made a lot of people scratch their heads, wondering why a country would agree to this. When the plane landed in Ghana, the confusion only grew deeper. The men were taken into custody by the Ghanaian military. Now you would think the next step would be clear. But it wasn't. 1 minute, the Ghanaian government was saying the men had already been sent on their way to their home countries. The Minister for Government Communications, Felix Kwakie Ofosu, even said a bus had been arranged for the Nigerians. But then, almost at the same time, lawyers for some of the men back in the US said something completely different. They claimed the men were still being held in a detention camp in Ghana. This is where the story gets really complicated. These men weren't just random migrants. Many of them had legal cases in the US. They had told American courts they were afraid to go back to their home countries. They feared they would be tortured or persecuted. The courts in the US had actually agreed with them, granting them something called fear-based relief. This relief is supposed to stop the US government from sending them back to the very place where they fear for their lives. But now, they were in Ghana, a country right next door to where they feared going, and nobody seemed to have a straight answer about what would happen next. So, the big question is, why would Ghana agree to this? When you hear about deals like this, you might think there was a lot of money involved. Maybe the US offered a huge financial package to sweeten the deal. But according to Ghana's foreign minister, Samuel Okudzeto Ablakwa, that's not what happened. He was very clear that Ghana received no money at all for this agreement. He said the decision was based purely on humanitarian principle. It was all about helping out, not cashing in. Which, depending on how you look at it, is either very noble or very naive. The Ghanaian government also framed the decision as an act of Pan-African solidarity. The idea of Pan-Africanism is that people of African descent have a shared history and destiny and should work together to support one another. From this point of view, Ghana was simply being a good neighbor. It was stepping up to help fellow Africans who were stuck in a difficult situation. The government argued that if these men couldn't go home and they couldn't stay in the US, then another African nation should offer them a safe haven. It's a powerful and idealistic message suggesting that Ghana is a leader in regional cooperation. However, not everyone in Africa was cheering for this display of solidarity. Nigeria, for instance, was not happy. The Nigerian government said it was not informed about this deal by either the US or Ghana. They have their own process for accepting deportees, and it involves sending people directly from the US to Nigeria, not through a third country. It's like your neighbor agreeing to accept your mail without telling you. It just creates confusion and raises questions about respect between nations. The government of the Gambia, the home country of the other deportee, remained silent on the issue, which only added to the mystery. Back in Ghana, the government's explanation did not satisfy everyone. Opposition lawmakers and human rights activists were very critical. They argued that such a major foreign policy agreement should have been brought before the National Assembly for debate and approval. They raised concerns about Ghana's sovereignty, asking if the country was becoming a dumping ground for other nations' problems. By making this deal in secret, the government opened itself up to accusations that it was undermining its own democratic processes and potentially violating its own constitution. The humanitarian argument was strong, but the political fallout was just as powerful. For the men who were deported, the journey itself was a nightmare. According to a lawsuit filed by their lawyers, they were taken from the detention center in Louisiana, shackled at their wrists and ankles, and put on the plane without being told their destination. Some of the men allegedly became so distressed that they were put in straitjackets for the long 16-hour flight. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security denied this specific claim, but the lawyers painted a picture of a terrifying and dehumanizing experience. Imagine being trapped on a plane for that long in restraints, with no idea where you are going or what will happen when you land. Once they arrived in Ghana, their situation didn't get much better. The lawyers described the place where they were held as a squalid and deplorable detention facility. They said it was an open-air camp run by the Ghanaian military. This is a far cry from the humanitarian welcome that the Ghanaian government talked about. While the government spokespeople were talking about Pan-African solidarity, the reality on the ground for these men seemed to be one of confinement and uncertainty. They had escaped a detention center in the U.S. only to end up in another one in Ghana with even fewer legal protections. This is where the legal battle really heated up. Back in the U.S., lawyers from groups like the ACLU filed a lawsuit on September 12, 2025. They argued that the U.S. government was using this deal with Ghana to get around its own laws. Remember, U.S. courts had already ruled that these men should not be sent back to their home countries because of the risk of torture. The lawyers argued that sending them to Ghana, a neighboring country, was just an indirect way of doing exactly that. It was like a loophole to deport people who were legally protected from deportation. The case went before a federal judge, Tanya Chutkan, who seemed to share some of these concerns. On September 15th, she directly questioned the legality of the whole operation. She ordered the Trump administration to explain how it was making sure that Ghana wouldn't just turn around and send the men to Nigeria or the Gambia, which would violate the U.S. court orders. The U.S. Department of Justice had a chilling response. They argued that once the men were in Ghana's custody, they were out of U.S. jurisdiction. In other words, they were no longer America's problem. This set the stage for a major showdown over human rights and a government's responsibility. This deal with Ghana is not a one-off thing. It's actually part of a much bigger strategy by the Trump administration. The U.S. government has been increasingly using what are called third country agreements to speed up deportations. The idea is simple. If you can't send someone back to their own country, you find another country that is willing to take them. Ghana is just the latest nation to sign up. Countries like Eswatini, Rwanda, and South Sudan have also accepted deportees from the U.S. under similar deals. It seems to be a new go-to tool in the U.S. immigration playbook. These agreements are spreading across the globe. It's not just an African phenomenon. In August 2025, Paraguay signed a similar deal. Other migrants have been sent to countries in Central America, like El Salvador and Costa Rica. The legal basis for this policy comes from a U.S. Supreme Court ruling in June 2025. The court decided that the government has the right to deport migrants to countries other than their own. This ruling opened the door for the administration to seek out these agreements more aggressively, changing how deportation works on a fundamental level. This policy raises some very serious questions for the whole world. For the deportees, it creates a terrifying legal limbo. They are sent to a country where they have no family, no connections, and often no legal rights. They are stuck with the constant fear that they could still be sent back to the danger they fled in the first place. For countries like Ghana, it creates a difficult choice. Do they accept these deals in the name of solidarity, or for other strategic reasons, even if it means becoming part of a system that many see as unjust and inhumane? Ultimately, this story is about more than just 14 men on a plane. It's about the future of international law and human rights. It forces us to ask what responsibility a country has for the people it deports. Does that responsibility end the moment they leave your airspace? And what does it mean for Pan-Africanism and regional cooperation when one country's humanitarian act is seen by another as a violation of its sovereignty? As of today, September 17, 2025, these questions remain unanswered, leaving the fate of many people hanging in the balance, somewhere between legal rulings and political deals.